There we go. Perfect. All right. So hello and welcome. So this is session 1 for Ignite Scorch. So this is the web development session for Ignite. I unfortunately missed session 0, so just a quick introduction. I'm Kieran. I'll be the person doing the lecture leading. I also write any of the a lot of the exercises and a lot of the sort of stuff behind the scenes. So if there's any problems with any of it, feel free to shoot a message to me, and I'm happy to help. Yeah, this course is really exciting. I love this course. I do a lot of web development. I've done web development for quite a few years now, and spent a lot of time doing contract work for web development. Spent a lot of time doing work at the university for web development and the web development team there. And I've spent a lot of time just doing web development on my own. So really excited, really passionate about it, really love it. And this course has a lot of really good content that's super useful for especially the practical side of just going out and actually building your own websites, which is the main focus of kind of what we're doing here. So with that being said, let's get started. The information for any of the days as we're going through, if you come on the website here, it will be under sessions and then Ignite Scorch. You can always find there should be the session here, and then the slides will be available there as well if you need to find those slides. The code that you'll see for the exercise files will be available also here under the GitHub link. And this shouldn't change, but if it does change, we'll let you know. There might be some small changes that we make. You might have to just re-download some of those files. But for now, basically, those exercise files should always be the same. So if you download them once, you should have them for the rest of the sessions. Let's grab that. And so let's get into it. So the first thing to look at is the anatomy of a web page. So what actually happens when you go to google.ca? There's a couple of different questions, like what is your browser actually doing? So the first thing is, how does your browser actually know what to show you? How does it know what content you need? How does it know how it's supposed to show up? How is all that sort of stuff look at? How does it know, like when you actually search something, why does something actually happen when you do that? Why isn't it just sit there or just keep showing you the same content? Why do things actually change on the web? How do they change? What sort of determines how they change? And how does your browser actually get all the information about the websites and make sure the information is the same? Like when it goes to google.ca, why don't you get the YouTube homepage sometimes? It's always google.ca. So why does all that stuff happen? That's kind of what we're going to try and cover throughout the course. Many of these questions we'll try and answer today as well. So the first one is, what is a web page? So when you load any page in a browser, there's a couple of languages that are working together to try and make what you're actually viewing come together. So the first one is HTML, and that's going to basically cover your structure. So kind of like the different elements and kind of the content that's there. So for example, when we're looking at something like this slide, for example, we see that there's a couple of different pieces of text. There's this big text up here. There's kind of the smaller text here. And there's like these bullet points, for example. That sort of stuff would be determined by your HTML on a web page. Then you have your CSS, which determines how this stuff looks. So how big this text is, why the font is this font specifically, why the colors are how they are. That sort of stuff will be controlled by your CSS. And then your JavaScript is what's going to decide your dynamic behaviors. So for example, when you start typing into a search bar on Amazon, and there's like autocomplete stuff that pops up, all of that will be determined by something like JavaScript, for example. So to get started, we'll start with the first one, which is the basics of HTML. So like we said earlier, this will basically give us our structure and our content for most of the web pages. So most nouns, whenever you're kind of describing a website, will be your HTML. So when we're looking at this image on the right hand side, we'll look at and see kind of there's a blue block of text that has an image underneath. So the fact that there is a block of text and then like an image that sort of shows up below that, that will be controlled by your HTML. And so HTML is broken up into elements. So we can see here the elements, like I was saying before. So this text is one element, and then this image is another element. And so specifically, this text is what's called a heading element or a heading 1 element, and then this image is what's called an image element. Pretty easy. Each element will have 3 different parts when we're looking at the code. So it'll have a start tag, an end tag, and then optionally, it'll have inner content and attributes. So we'll talk about what all this kind of looks like. And as we're going through, feel free to open up your Visual Studio Code. So I have mine open right here, for example. Feel free to pop up in Visual Studio Code and just kind of create a new file that's just exercise1.html. And just feel free to open it up and type along some stuff as you're listening to the slides and as you're watching the slides as we're going through here. There'll be some time at the end to also look at this, but sometimes it can be helpful to start typing stuff out as we're going, just because we're going to cover some super basic stuff. So here's kind of a motivating example. It's good sometimes when you're trying to build a page to pick a topic. So you can either write about yourself if you really want to. If you don't want to write about yourself, you can write about a game, something like that. But just try using some of the tags that we're going to cover as we go to create a page as we're going through here. So let's look at our first element here. So this is what's called an H1 tag. And so for this element, this first thing, let me quickly make this bigger so it's a little bit easier to read. If we go ahead and we add in a little angle here, and then we do H1, and then we close it, we can see here, it's gone ahead and added this end part here. So this is that part that I was talking about. That's the start tag. And then this is what's called the end tag. And within that, we then have whatever our tag name is. So in our case, we're saying H1. This is basically telling them, telling the browser whenever it reads this, what type of tag you want to use. And then this is telling it where it should end. This is telling it where it should start. And then inside that, we can put some context. We can say, hey, this is some text. And if we were to go ahead, for example, and pop open a browser, drag this into the browser, we can see here, this is what we get. Some text at the top here that says, hey, this is some text. So that's the basics of how an HTML element works. We can go ahead and we could change this around and we would get a different element. So if we change this from an H1 to an H2, for example, what we get is we get what's called a heading 2, which is a smaller heading that shows up there. And we could change that to whatever we wanted to. This inner portion is what's called the inner content. And then we don't have any attributes yet, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's the very basics. And that's how most of your HTML is going to work, is it's just going to be simply a tag with a little bit of content inside of it like that. And so another common tag that we have is paragraphs. So if we go ahead and we add in a paragraph tag here, we can go ahead and add in some more text. And what this is going to be just sort of your basic plain text that you see at the bottom here. Typically speaking, whenever you're doing a web page, you'll have some headings and then you'll have sort of paragraphs underneath them, just because you start making your text sort of smaller as it goes down. But that's not a hard and fast rule. You can add in everything into heading elements if you really want to. It doesn't really matter. But basically, those are the first two elements that we see here. There's sort of some plain text elements. Headings go from 1 to 6. So we go heading 1 is the largest all the way down to heading 6. So heading 1, very big. Heading 6 is actually slightly smaller than a regular paragraph tag. So as you're going down, you're working your way down, you'll get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go. Most websites, the way this works is they kind of break it up. You want to think about it kind of like book chapters. So you might have something like H1 being the title of whatever the book is. And then each H2 would be kind of chapters. And then if you have like subsections within chapter, that might be an H3, et cetera, et cetera. Usually the smaller is kind of like the heading for that specific section sort of thing. So you don't have to use it that way, but that's the way that a lot of people tend to use these. So one more thing about HTML elements is the attributes. And so these are basically just like attributes that you'd find on classes. So I assume everybody here has already covered Python before you got to this course. So attributes in Python, you have something like a class, like maybe like a ball or something like that. And a ball might have an X and a Y position in a game. Those would be your attributes. The X and the Y would be your attributes. HTML elements have the same thing. And in a lot of cases, some HTML elements will rely on those attributes in order to pass some data in. So in this case, we're looking at what's called an anchor tag, which is A. And what that is that's basically your basic link. So if we go in here, we go ahead and we add in an anchor tag here, it'll add in what's called an href here. And so we say href equals and then 2 brackets. So this is the href attribute. And if we hover over it in Visual Studio Code, it'll kind of explain stuff. It'll say contains a URL or URL fragment that the hyperlink points to. So what this means is that if we were to say, for example, say https://google.ca, and we were to say, click me, if I go ahead and refresh that page we were looking at in here, we can see here it says click me. And if I went and click this, it would take me to google.ca. So attributes can be used to pass in data to a whole bunch of different tags, but one of the most common ones you're going to run into is an anchor tag. And so this is what you're going to want to use if you want to have any sort of links that are going to anywhere else on the web. You'll want to use this. Or if you have a website that has multiple pages, which we'll be dealing with down the road, you'll be able to have links to your other pages of your site via this as well. One other handy attribute that you have with anchor tags is what's called a target. So if we go ahead and start typing in target, it'll actually autofill it for us, and it'll give us some options for ones that we can select. Basically, if you're including target, you're pretty much always going to want to include an _blank. What this does is it just basically says, hey, open me up in a new window. So before we saw, whenever I clicked on this, it'll take me to google.ca inside the same tab. If you want to make it go there without going to the same tab, but open up a new tab, you add in the underscore blank, and now it does that. So super easy. Same way we worked with Python objects before. Essentially, you can just add attributes to give the data to the browser that it needs to be able to do all this extra functionality. Okay. So one of the cool things about HTML, and one of the reasons why it's really great for what it does, is that you can do what's called nesting. And so what nesting does is it allows you to have HTML that sits inside of other HTML. And what this means is that it kind of flows down the effects of the HTML as you put stuff inside of it. So with our anchor tag, for example, if we wanted to make this anchor tag bigger, one of the ways that we could do this is we could, instead of just having a regular anchor tag, which is kind of like paragraph sort of size, what we could do here is we could take this tag and we could put an H1 tag here, and we could wrap our anchor tag inside the H1. So you can see here, we have our anchor tag now inside the H1. And what this is going to do is going to take the size of the H1 tag, and it's going to take the attributes that you have inside here for the anchor tag, and it's going to combine them together. So when we're looking at this, we now get an H1 sized anchor tag that works the same as we saw before. There's a ton of elements you can use nesting for that will pass down sort of those behaviors that you want from one element onto other elements as well as you go. And so all of that stuff is super useful to use in conjunction with whatever you're trying to do. So we have our first question for today, which is we have the elements here. What are the elements and their attribute values? So that'll be over on Top Hat, and we'll just give you a little bit to take a look at that and try answering those questions. Okay, so we hit the end of the minute for this one. And so with this question, the elements that we have here, we can see, like we saw before, we have the name for each of the elements here. So in this case, we have one div, we have an H1, and then we have an anchor tag. And then we can see here with everything else, these are all just the ending tags for those tags that we saw before. So that's all of the different elements that we have. And then for each of the attribute values, we then have value one, which is the attribute one here on the div. We then have google.ca, which is the attribute href here. And then we have underscore blank, which is for the target here. And then we don't have any for H1. So that would be the answer in this case, which I believe is A. Yeah, it's A in this case. Next, what would show up if you were given this code here? Okay, so that one's been a minute. So in this case, we would have taken those two different answers that you could have put for this. So in this case, if we were just looking at the content that's inside here, we'd have an H1 that then has an A tag that has a that ends right here, and then it continues right here. So that would be text that is hello world size, where the hello would be an anchor tag, and then the world would just be inside just the H1 tag here. So they would both be H1 size, but only the hello would be clickable, which would be a link. So that would be A. Alternatively, you could have also put E, because E is what would actually show up. It's a bit of a trick question, but A would also be accepted as well. So one of the important things to keep in mind, and the reason that we have this question here, is that although it's nice that stuff is kind of passed down as you add things inside of different elements, keep in mind that there's also consequences that can happen when you change stuff further up. So if you have something like a div here that contains these two elements, if you set something like hidden equal to true, which hides something in the browser, then everything inside of it will also be hidden. There's no way to specify rules that say only affect certain things. Whatever the rules are for whatever you're trying to do will be applied further down as you go. So if I added an anchor tag outside here, for example, and then wrapped it around everything here, everything inside of here would be wrapped by that anchor tag, except for this anchor tag inside here, because it's a little bit more specific. So this one would be applied, would have its own tag as well. So just keep that in mind, is that anything that you do higher up can affect things further down. A lot of errors that you'll run into later on will just be because of that as well. So the next tag that we're looking at is an image tag. This is one of the only tags that you don't have to put an end tag for. It's one of the only exceptions. But basically, we just have image, and then the attribute that you pass it is source. And that can be a URL or a path to a file. So if we go ahead, we copy and paste the example that we had there. We have image, and then we have source. And this one will automatically close itself. It's one of the only tags that does it. And basically what that'll do, if we go ahead and come in here and we refresh, we can see here we have the image. We have a giant SVG just down here. So super simple system to work with. As you're going through, if you do find for stuff like images and for anchors, because there's a lot of things that are commonly used with them, if you're using Visual Studio Code, if I go ahead and just type in IMG, for example, and then I just hit enter, it will actually create the image tag for me, and it'll create this SRC attribute. So if you sometimes find yourself forgetting to do stuff like this, what you can do is just, if you come in here, just type in IMG and just hit enter. This emit system is basically a system for generating HTML, and it will generate for a lot of these things that have like necessary attributes, it'll generate those for you as well. So if I go ahead and, for example, add an anchor tag, if I go ahead and hit A, you'll see here we have options for various different types of links, as well as the option for a blank link. So if I go ahead and click that, that'll give me everything that I need for opening it in a new tab with the URL that I want. So that can be super handy for making things a little bit faster and easier for you. All right. Now, lists in HTML, there's two different types of lists that you're running to. There'll be ordered list or an unordered list. And so the way this works is that ordered lists are like what you're seeing here, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It counts up every time you add something new. Unordered lists are like bullet point lists. There's no order to them, basically. Both of these will basically follow the pattern where you have whatever type of list you want, and then inside that, you'll put what are called list items. So we can see here, for an ordered list, we'd have an OL, which is the tag name for ordered list, and then we have LI, which is the list items. If you want to do an unordered list, we'd swap the O for U and do an unordered list. So what this looks like, if I go ahead and decide here, and I just go ahead and do OL, and then LI, step 1, LI, step 2, step 3. If I come back in here, take a look, we have step 1, step 2, step 3, just like that. And then if I change the O to a U, and then save it, then we get the bullet points inside. So basically, same process for both of those. It's just that you change which of the two you want to use, depending on which one you want. If you want the numbers, add in the OL. If you don't want the numbers, use UL, essentially. You'll find this pattern of having certain elements need to be included inside for a lot of different HTML tags. So tables are another one. If you want to add a table row, those will all be inside of another table. You'd have a table, and then each of the table rows themselves will be nested inside of that as well. So yeah, so there's the unordered list example, just like that. So the next thing that you'll see is divs. So we saw that earlier in the previous example. Divs, basically all they do is let you group stuff. Basically just says, I'm going to put stuff in a group. That's all a div does. It doesn't actually show up as anything. Like if I come in here and I, let's say I get rid of this image, I get rid of this stuff, and I just have a div inside of here. If I go back and refresh, there's nothing there. Divs don't actually show up as anything. But what they're useful for is you can put other things inside of a div. So if I put all of this stuff inside of a div, now I can kind of have a thing that doesn't do anything. You can't see anything different, but now all that stuff is grouped together, which can be handy for, like we saw earlier, if I wanted to hide this content, for example, I could just say hidden. And then if I come back in here, now that's being hidden for me. And anything that I would have put inside there can be hidden as well. So this will be useful when we look at CSS, because CSS kind of works off that same idea of things that are grouped together applies to each other. And comments. So if you do want to add in a comment, you basically just do this syntax. So it's a little bit weird. It's a little bit awkward. It's the longest way of doing a comment possible in a language, but essentially it's just like that. And then you go and you add in a little exclamation point and then 2 dashes. And then anything that you put inside of here is good to go. Comments are all multi-line in HTML. So if I go ahead and I want to put stuff down here, doesn't matter. There is no way to do a single line comments. Everything is multi-line comments in HTML. So you can put whatever comments you want to make your stuff easier to work with. The big thing with HTML to understand is that HTML doesn't really do much of your doesn't do any of your actual data processing. The whole point of HTML is to just show off your data. So it's basically like this is the thing that just sort of shows off all of what you have there. None of your like actual logic is really going to be inside the HTML. That'll be for JavaScript and other stuff later on. Everything will just be kind of what shows up inside here. So if you're ever running into any bugs with something and how it appears, usually you're going to take a look at your HTML, make sure that's right first, and then go from there. There's some more tags. If you're interested in, you can look at those on your own time. But now we've been looking at just a regular HTML file like this, where we just have some tags inside of it. We're chucking some stuff inside of it. We're good to go. This works because the browser allows it to work. But technically speaking, this isn't how you're supposed to set up this is how you're supposed to create a document. The actual way you create a document in HTML has several parts to it. And they all have good reasons for being there. So the first, let me just show you what this looks like. So if I go ahead and I come into here and I just hit exclamation point inside of an HTML file and hit enter and then click it, we'll see here a whole bunch of stuff just got spawned into our document. So the first line here is what's called our type declaration. The reason this exists is that a browser can support multiple different types of documents. And so what this tells it is that you want a document that is supposed to be read as HTML. This is the default that it usually assumes that you want, but it's good to include it because then it knows, the browser knows what you want. There's other doc types that you can use. This gets a little bit more complicated, but it just changes the way that the browser reads your file, essentially. After that, we have an HTML tag. And our HTML tag basically will contain all of the rest of our HTML inside of it. So everything that you want to be part of your HTML should go inside this HTML tag. From there, and the main reason that we do this is so that it makes it easier for us to do things like this, where we say language is equal to English. This is handy for a bunch of different browser features, one of them being translations. If somebody who is Spanish reads this and they have the language set to Spanish, for example, this will tell the browser, hey, do you want to translate this page? So whenever you go to like, somebody's page on some forum somewhere that's in Spanish, for example, the reason why Google knows to ask you, hey, do you want to translate this from Spanish, is because it sees this in the document. So always good to include it, especially since you only have to hit exclamation point to generate this inside your VS Code to do this. Next is head, and this is a bit of a weirder thing that you probably haven't run into before, but this is basically your metadata. So this is essentially the data about the page that you're writing. So this isn't your content. This isn't any of that sort of stuff. This basically tells the browser a bunch of extra stuff about your page. So this might be the title, for example. So if we actually were to go in here and I were to say, hello world, right? If we come in here, we can see we have exercise 1.html. If I go ahead and refresh, we now see hello world at the top. So our title obviously is the title that we get on the page. There's a bunch of other stuff inside here. This stuff that includes by default is just handy for a bunch of other libraries to work. You don't need to worry about what it means right now, but there will be stuff down the road if you do go further into web developments that you'll need to add things into your head. lots of stuff like Google Analytics tracking, lots of other things like that will oftentimes need you to put stuff in the head. This is also where a lot of people will include different things that need to be downloaded that help the page load itself. So everything that doesn't actually show up goes in the head because the head isn't actually visible on the page. Everything that's going to be content goes inside your body. So if we go ahead, we can grab this stuff and we go inside the body and we go ahead and paste it. And then if I go ahead and refresh, it looks exactly the same. But now that we have this setup all done, this is basically just what you're supposed to actually do. This is basically what the rules say you're supposed to do. I would recommend doing it. You can get away with not doing this, and your page will still oftentimes load, but there will be certain things that won't work for it. So certain tools will be built around assuming that your pages are set up this way. And so stuff that you do down the road might not work because of it. So just keep that in mind as you're going through. And I would always just recommend whenever you're creating a new page, just hit exclamation points and then hit enter, and it'll generate all that stuff for you. Super easy to do. You can go from there. Okay. So yeah, that's all the stuff that I just covered. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a couple of minutes now, and you can just go through and try working through creating a page. HTML5 does the same thing as exclamation point. They made it shorter now, so you don't have to worry about that in the slide. I haven't just changed that yet, but hit exclamation point, create your page, and just try creating a page about yourself or about something else that you're interested in, and just try messing around with some of the tags. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to give that a shot. Oh, do the recording. And so with that, yeah, so basically we can just put together a quick little page. So if I had something like, if I want to put together a page about myself, we just have a heading on top here. And then I could put some information about myself, but I'm just going to generate some fake text instead. And then maybe just like a list of my favorite hobbies or something like that. Then have games, scuba diving, and skiing. Now if we refresh, as we have. So that's really it for getting your page started. But now that we kind of have these pages, this isn't the most appealing thing in the world. As you can tell, it's not exactly, it doesn't look like most websites that you're typically used to running into. So now the question is, okay, well, how do we make this look a little bit better? And so that's where CSS comes in. So CSS basically changes how things look. So it works very closely with your HTML, and it basically describes most of the adjectives that you have on a page. So for example, that blue block of text that is 3 EM, which is a size, and the image is just 250 pixels underneath. The blue, the fact that it was how large the text is and how big the image is, all of that stuff will be controlled by CSS, for example. So there's a couple of different options for how we can use CSS. So the first is inline. And so what that does is directly on the element, we can add CSS to the actual element that we're looking at. So if I'm in here and I have like Kieran, for example, then I wanted it to be red, what I could do in here is I could just add in a style attribute. Style attribute is available on every single element. And what it'll let you do is, well, it'll let you add CSS. And so the way that CSS works is it's very similar to if you're used to in Python, what's called a dictionary, or if you've used those, I'm not sure if they cover those in the previous courses, but you essentially say what rule you want, and then you say sort of what the value is going to be. So in this case, for example, let's say something like color, and then I put a colon, and then I put whatever the value is that I want. So in my case, I might say something like red. And then I always have to end it with a semicolon. And this would be what a CSS rule looks like. So we're basically saying that we want the color of this text to be red. And now if we go back, we refresh, the color of the text is red. And then if I want it to be large, what I could do is I could start doing font dash size, and then I could do a colon, and then I could say, let's say extra large in this case. And then I could do a semicolon. And now if I come back into here, we now have what's ironically actually a smaller size piece of text. So that's the basics. You just have sort of whatever the thing is, and then on the right hand side you have whatever the value is. So it's very similar to attributes that you'd find on like an object, for example, and you just add those. You can add those per element by adding them inline. But remember, if you do add something inside of here, it will cascade down. So if you add in like more text inside of this, it would also be red, for example. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your items, that anything that goes inside the other HTML will also have the rules applied from whatever's above it. So yeah, here we have color red, and then we have font size 24 pixels, and we can change that around. You'll also find that almost all of your CSS rules will have multiple different types of measurements that you can use. So you can use pixels, you could use, like I showed you before, extra large, large, whatever. There's lots of different measurements that you can use to do most of the things you're doing. You could say color red, for example. There's also HSV, RGB. There's a whole bunch of other different like schemes you can use to assign a lot of these variables. The other option is you can have a style tag. And so what a style tag is it's basically an HTML tag that has your style inside of it. So instead of having a style here, what I can do instead is I can just say style, and I can have it in here. Since this doesn't need to show up, since we're just defining the rules for our CSS, most people tend to put it in the head just so it doesn't show up at all. So we can see here we have a style, but now the question is, okay, well, how do we tell it what element we want to apply the style to? Because if we just say color red in here, well, color red for what, right? So what we do inside of CSS is we have what's called a selector. So for tags, if we want to say for every H1, we want to make all of them red, we could just say H1, we put some brackets, and then we put our rules inside the squiggly brackets in here. So we just say color red, that goes inside here, and then we add our semicolon like we did down here, and it works exactly the same. If we want to add more rules, we just keep adding rules inside of here. So we could say instead of extra large, we could say like 32 pixels, for example. And then if we got rid of that, went back here and refreshed, we have the same thing, but bigger. So these selectors come in a lot of different forms, but this is kind of the more complicated part of CSS is basically choosing your selectors. So like we have the H1 here, for example, but let's say we had an H1 down here that we didn't want to have some styling applied to. How can we control that? There's some ways of doing it. We'll talk about them in a little bit here, but just keep that in mind that whatever rules you set that have the tag name in them will affect everything that has that tag name. Okay. The last option is that we can do a file. So if we didn't want to include any of this stuff inside of our actual HTML file that we're looking at here, we could just take all of this, we could put it into something like styles.css, put our stuff in there, and then in the head of our section here, we could just go ahead and hit link, and you'll see there's a thing that shows up that says link:CSS. We can add that in there, and then we just put whatever the file name is right there. And that will do the exact same thing and just basically load it from a file. So all three of these options work. They all have their upsides and downsides. You can choose which one you want to use. Generally speaking, most of the time, what you're going to see for this course is that I'll typically just add my styles in here like that. So you'll see I'll add my styles at the top because it's just easier for me to keep everything all organized at the top here. But you can use whatever you want for the course. All right, cool. So selectors, there are a ton of rules about how selectors work, tons of them. So there's a reference down here. The basics are there's a special type of attribute that we can add to our HTML elements called a class. This is a very common one that we'll use whenever we're doing selectors. And the way that works is that anything that we add into a class, we can say dot and then whatever the class name is, and it'll show up. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to have some red text in here. What we could do is we could create a class inside here that's called red text. So I can say dot red dash text like this, right? And this basically just says make the color red. That's what our CSS rule is. Now, on any of our elements that we wanted to add this to, all that we do, let's say we want to do it for this paragraph and then maybe this H1 tag at the same time, we just go and say class is equal to, and we can say red dash text like that. So now both of these two classes have red text on them. So what's going to happen? Well, if I come back in here and I refresh, we now see this text is red and this text is red up here. So everywhere that this class exists, that rule will be applied to it basically. And we can have more than one class. So if we wanted to say, for example, big text, for example, we can have that just applied to the H1 tag, and we could say, all right, dot big text, we want that to be, font size like 50 pixels, something like that, right? And now that'll only apply to that one thing. So classes is a great way of basically saying what you want it to do, and then you can just add those to whatever elements you want those rules to be applied to. The other option is if you want to target one thing, like one element out of the entire document that you're working with, is to use what's called an ID. So ID is also reserved. So class and ID are two special types of attributes. So if I go ahead and I say ID and then equal to, let's just say intro, for example, dot will let you target classes. Just using regular text like this will let you target the tag name. And then to target IDs, you use a hash. So we can say hash, and then we say intro, and then we can put whatever we want to put to target just this one occurrence of the H1 that we have here. And if we move this ID to something else, we can have it down here like that. The big thing with IDs is there has to only be one thing that has each of those IDs on it. So you can't have ID intro here as well. That's not allowed in the document. You have to have only one of them. The page will not crash, but your document won't work properly. So just keep that in mind. HTML will rarely ever crash. It won't like crash your browser. It won't destroy your browser. It won't do any of that stuff. HTML tries to avoid crashes as much as it possibly can. But what it will do is it'll break whatever functionality you're trying to do. So different browsers don't guarantee the same behavior when you do stuff like this. So make sure for IDs, you only have one of those on each of your page for each of the IDs you're going to use. So if we have ID intro here, we only have one ID intro. Just make sure you do that. If you don't, different browsers will do different stuff with it. So just be careful. Okay, and that slide will have information about how to use different CSS selectors and all the references for it. But basically, those are going to be the main ones we're going to use are just these right here, which is classes and IDs. Those are the main ones that we're going to use. Yes, this is the tag name. You can just have the tag name. You just include it. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to put anything before it. And then if you want to have class, you use a dot. If you want to have ID, use a hash. That's basically it. Like I said before, you can also you can target basically things that exist within something else as well. So as we go ahead and start stacking these rules, let's say, for example, we only wanted to target the paragraph tags that are inside of a div. So if I had something like a div here, and I wanted to only target the paragraph tag that's inside this div, so this would only affect this paragraph tag, but not this paragraph tag. All that you do is you just keep stacking them. So if I say div here, I'm basically saying, okay, find a div, and then my next rule can be space, and then whatever the next rule is going to be. So if I say space and then P, in this case, I'm saying find a div with a paragraph inside of it. And Visual Studio Code, if you ever get confused with this, if you hover over it, will tell you what you're doing. So this is what it shows up. It says, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a div, and then I'm looking for something inside of it that has a paragraph tag inside of it. If I change this instead, and I said, I'm looking for a div that has hashtag intro inside of it like this. If I went inside here, you're looking for some type of elements that has an ID of intro inside of it. So if you hover over it in VS Code, it'll tell you what you're looking for, basically. Okay, so next question. How could we make all this text red? Give you a minute for that. Okay, so that's been a minute. So in this case, we would be looking for B. One of the ways you can kind of cheat with some of these questions, by the way, is that VS Code has syntax highlighting. So you can see A, C, and D don't have white text on the left-hand side instead of blue. So B is the only one that's correct because it's the only one that exists. Don't just use that to cheat, though. Make sure you know how it actually works. But in this case, B would be the correct answer because it's the only one, it's the only CSS rule that actually exists. So color means text color in this case, not the background color. That's a different thing. That's called background. So just keep that in mind as well when you're looking at this. Like I was saying, let your editor help you. Whenever you're typing in any of your CSS, when you start typing something in, it'll find it for you. If you're not sure how something works, if you hover over whatever the text is, oftentimes it'll just tell you what you're doing and sort of the options that you have for it. Okay, so here's our pages that have even better CSS. You can see applied to them, look fantastic. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to give you guys a few minutes. You can take those pages that you were working on before and just try styling them. Try messing around, try changing the background color, try changing the font family, font size, text color, all that sort of stuff. Just go ahead and mess around with it. We'll give you a couple of minutes for that. Okay, cool. If you guys are interested as well with any of the stuff after the fact, a lot of these slides, if you find anything kind of confusing or any problems that you run into, a lot of the slides will actually have some example code in them. So you can see here, like we have the example code for this stuff here. So if you do want to mess around with it and see kind of what that stuff looks like, you can also work off some of these examples if you want to in the future as well. All right, so we're just going to talk about a couple of common styles. So these are just going to be things you can kind of use on whatever element you want. So the height and width, kind of obvious. You set the height and the width of an element. You basically just have, let's say something like this, where we have just a height, and then we can have something in there. So we can have like 10 pixels, for example. That would make something the height of 10 pixels. With CSS also, by the way, these commas basically mean that you can add in multiple things. So you can have, for example, this is an H1, a paragraph tag, LI, H2. All of those are being applied to this rule. So our height, super simple. We have pixels, we have percentages, we have all of that sort of stuff. Width, you'll find you can have something like 50%, for example. That'll work. You can have something like viewport height or viewport width. So you can say VW for viewport width or VH for viewport height. Whole bunch of different measurements you can use. Most of the time, you're going to be dealing with, though, percentages and pixels. 9 times out of 10 is what you're going to run into. So whenever you're dealing with width and height, basically just percentages or pixels should be good enough for you. You can also set the max width and the min width. So for example, if somebody's page or somebody has like a page that they're zooming in or zooming out, you could say, for example, that it has to be at minimum at least 50% of the page, or for example, it can only go up to a maximum of 75% of the page. So if you want something to on bigger screens take up 75%, but then on smaller screens you don't want it to go beyond that 75%, you can set a max or a min, and those are just max or min before the height. These are all the different units. Don't worry about most of them. You're not going to use 90% of those, if I'm being honest with you, and everybody else forgets what they mean. So you can just look them up afterwards. The only thing that you will run into sometimes is for a height. If you want something to take up an entire screen, you'll want to use VH, which is the viewport height. So on heights, you can say height, VH, and then color black, and that will cover somebody's entire screen when they first start opening a page. This is often used for pages that only have like one thing that they want to show. Like a coming soon page might have like a timer in the middle and they want to cover the whole page. They might use something like this. So just keep that in mind. The next thing is element spacing. So elements basically work with kind of a complicated system where they have what's called margin, border, and padding. So the elements is kind of the thing that's in the middle. You have kind of whatever size that element is. And then from there, you'll have the padding, which sits just outside of it. And then you have the margin, which sits outside of that, and the border in between those two. The big thing with this is padding changes what happens inside an element. Margin changes what happens outside of an element. So if you add padding to something, for example, so in this case, we're saying we're going to add padding to the top, padding to the left, padding to the right, and padding to the bottom for this little square that we have here. So in this case, we have a div that would be 25 by 25 pixels with our width and height that we set here. But there's an extra 5 pixels in every direction of black. And the reason for that is that the padding is expanding the inside of the div to make it have more black there. Margin, on the other hand, if we look at margin, that only adds sort of like a barrier outside. So if we have something that's 25 by 25 pixels that has padding, then technically speaking, it's a 30 by 30 pixel block. And then we have 5 pixels of space on every direction for any other elements that are there. So if we had multiple of these in a row, we would have, let's say 2 of them on top of each other. We would have 10 pixels of space between them, and then 2 30 by 30 squares, essentially. So margin, you can think about kind of like almost like a shield. It's like it pushes away other elements away from you. Padding expands what you are to be larger, essentially, is how it works. And then border is just kind of a thing that you kind of hangs out and makes things look cool. So border does have some other uses, but for the most part, border is just there to make stuff look cool. The main thing that you do is you use border radius, and then you can add stuff to it. So if we're looking here, for example, we can say border radius of 0% is a square. And then let's say 5%, it basically rounds 5% of the border. You can add different numbers for different amounts. So this is basically saying top left, bottom right is 5%, and then 15% here. So we see the top corners are kind of more round than the other corners. And if you just make it 50%, you get a circle. So if you want something to be circular, border radius 50%, and it basically says 50% of the border is going to collapse in on itself. So super useful. Let's go from there. So designing from scratch is kind of hard. CSS is kind of just difficult to get used to, and it's also just like trying to come up with your own design on the fly. It kind of sucks. So we're going to talk about some common practices to make it a bit easier to design from scratch. And later on, and like in future sessions, we're going to talk about just not designing from scratch and using other tools to help you get started a bit easier. So what I always say is work your way inward. So when you have an HTML page, start from the biggest thing and then work to the smallest thing from there. So this star here basically says everything. So this says for every element, do these things. These rules, the only one that like this stuff at the top here, just basically by default, some browsers add in spacing like margins and padding and stuff to different elements. This just deletes all of that. This basically all these first three things say is delete all of the defaults that the browser is telling you to do. Listen to me, listen to what I say. All right, I'm the captain now. Listen to what I have to say about this. And so this stuff will be in the slides, so you can just copy it if you really want to, these rules. And then the last one at the bottom just says sans serif. This is just a nice font, basically. It's just a nicer font than the default one. So for most of your stuff, you just want to copy and add this to the top of it if you're going to design from scratch, because these are just good starting rules to start from. From there, there's kind of two main ways you can set up your main content. You can have your body, and then you can have content that goes inside there, or some people prefer to have a div that then has like a class of content, and then they put their content inside of here. It doesn't matter. It's just preference, basically. So whichever one you think is better for you, just use that, essentially. And then from there, here's kind of the four things that you want to change by default to a page to make it kind of look just a little bit nicer. So the first thing is going to be the content width. Second thing is going to be your fonts. Third is going to be your colors. And fourth is going to be sort of the special extra stuff that you add onto each element from there. So content width, there's two different sort of like main sort of debates that go on. So some people say that you should have full bleed, and some people say that you don't. What this means down the road is that full bleed, you can see here, this picture on the left-hand side here, means your content goes all the way. So your content takes up the entirety of the page. You want to fill everything in the page basically as much as you can. Padded basically means that it doesn't take up your whole page. So if I go ahead and I click on this link here and I wait for it to load, which might take a second. And if I click on the full bleed one, you can see what the full bleed example looks like. You can see here, every pixel is being used. Every inch of every pixel in this page is being used. The content is basically filled in here. Something like this, you can see everything is kind of like sectioned off into the center. It's all kind of squished down. It's made into the center. And then there's mixed, which would be something like this page here, where the top part is full bleed. It goes all the way to the edges, but then the content that's inside here is not full bleed. So it doesn't take up the whole thing. It's all design preferences. Some people say you don't want to use the whole monitor because for people like me, for example, I have an ultra wide monitor. If somebody has a big monitor, if you have some text way off in one corner, nobody's going to be able to read it. Other people say that padded stuff kind of looks a little bit awkward because it's all squished together. It's all just your own preferences, but at whichever one you go with, you'll want to set that before you start building out the rest of your page. So the way that you do that is either your body or your content, depending on which of these two you chose. So either your body right here or your content, you'll just set the width on it, essentially. Just pick a width. I usually do this. So this is also in the speaker's notes if you want to go in there. So the things in here, you can just copy paste it. This margin 0 auto centers your content. This basically says don't put any margin on the tops and bottoms, and put margin in the left and right even amounts, essentially, is what auto says. So squish everything together into the center. And then this is just saying limit it to 120 characters. So this stuff you can just copy paste in, but these are some good options. And you can find the speaker's notes just in the slides. So go into the slides and they'll just be at the bottom of any of the slides that you come on. So like right now we're on slide 60. It'll just be down here at the bottom. Okay. font, text, all that sort of stuff. Way too complicated to get into for this course. Here's sort of the basics. There's color, there's the alignment, your height, your size, and your family. The color is just that, it's just your colors. The alignment basically says if you want it to be centered or if you want it to be kind of left aligned. So if we look at a page like this, for example, we can see here, this text right here is left aligned. It's aligned to the left-hand side of whatever the thing is inside there. Whereas this text in here is centered. All of it's trying to stay in the center of the page. So you can just say that by just saying text dash align and then colon, and you can say left, right, or center. Line height is just how high, how tall all of your characters are. And then font size is just your size of your font, basically. So line height, basically just don't make it too small. If you make it too small, you'll crush everything. If you make it too big, it's hard to read. So this is what 0.5 looks like. This is what 1 looks like. This is what 3 looks like. 1.6 is pretty good. You can just set that on there. Smaller text needs more line height so that you can transition. So like here, for example, you can see it's sort of crushing out this little wavy line underneath here. So you need more line height for it. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing anything that you're making. There's stuff here you can play around with that'll tell you stuff about line heights, but essentially just for any of these things, there is, I believe, on this section, I believe it's on, yeah, right here. So on here, for example, in this code, it'll just have all the stuff that I was just talking about right here. So these are all the sensible defaults, and you can change them to according to what you want. So if you find your text is too small, you can just come in here and change the font size in here. So the font size in here is that's 2M by default. You can make it 3, 4, 5 bigger. You can make it 15 pixels, 32 pixels, 64 pixels, whatever you want. But I would just copy these settings by default, and then you have sort of a page that you can start from. And this is kind of what it looks like on the right-hand side when you change that, as compared to something like this by default. So it just basically makes things look a little bit nicer from there. So we just covered a couple of different things in CSS. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a chance to sort of mess around with them as you go. If you do want images, there's a website here called unsplash.com. This lets you have free images that you can just look up in Google and put into your site as well. So if you want to mess around with it, you can usually just type in like whatever you want. Like if you want a frog, for example, you just type in some sort of frog like this, and you can just right click it and hit copy image link. And you can put that inside of an image source and use it as an image if you want. So you can use border radius, you can use any of the stuff that we've covered so far. And I would just recommend grabbing this text and then just sort of using that as kind of a template to help build out some of your sites as you're going. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that out. Alrighty. So just with copying the code that we had in the previous slides. So this is kind of what this default page looks like. So if we look at this, we have just like a div with the image and some text, and then a div with some text and a list. And by default, this is kind of what we get. We get a massive, giant, big frog here. And then we have the text right here. You can see here, it's got kind of this weird spacing at the sides and all the different spacings that are in here. And it's using this, the default font. If we just apply just those rules that I posted in there, and then we limit the size of the image, so we have something like this. So if we're looking at these pages, we have just the rules that I talked about that I had in the speaker's notes that you can copy and paste, and then just adding image, a little bit of a radius, and then those there. So I'll go ahead and check this in the chat as well, just to make it a little bit easier so people don't have to search for it as well. Put that in there. And then those are basically kind of the ones that you can use by default. Okay. So with that, colors. Basically, here's the reality, is that the thing that you're looking for is readability. Whenever you're looking at a page, nobody ever said, man, I'm really glad I can't see anything on this page. There's never been a single person in their life who's ever said that that's been like a really enjoyable experience for them. So what you're really looking for is you want something that's functional. So colors can be cool, and you can try and do things that are, you know, like new and innovative. But if the page sucks and it can't be read, it doesn't really matter how innovative you are if nobody cares to read whatever you're looking at. So with colors, the big things to look at are contrast. So you can see here, it's basically lightness and darkness is kind of what people say for contrast, but it's also just the difference in colors. So you can see here, this text, it's really hard to read this. In fact, some of you who are colorblind probably can't actually read the fact there's actually text here that says this in this section right here. Over here, you have something that's very high contrast, where you have something dark on something white. So contrast, basically, it can be created with colors as well. And it makes it so that it's easier for people to read what you're looking at. So that's one of the main things with the colors that I look at, is making sure that you have high contrast whenever you're looking at stuff. That being said, please, so with any of this, if you're worried about how contrasty your stuff is, there's actually tools you can use to analyze how contrasty your stuff is. So these are some tools you can use for that. And on top of that, just keep in mind that dark doesn't always mean black. You can use colors that are just kind of like a dark gray if you really want to. You don't have to use just like black, for example. There's some stuff, if you're really old as well, some people have some diseases that make it so that if you have like literally pure black on pure white, they get a ghosting effect that happens for their eyes. So you don't always just want to go like completely black and completely white. I think this has some images on it. No, it doesn't. Okay. But basically what happens is sometimes people's eyes kind of like shift the text. So just here are some options you can choose. These are basically some colors that you can use, where you can just copy the colors and paste them in if you want to use them as well. This is the big thing. Please do not do any of these crimes against humanity. Do not pick colors that are contrasty in a terrible way. If your site looks like this, you have done something wrong. All right. At this point, yeah, if it's hurting your soul, then usually just stop, just reel it back a little bit, basically, is the main thing. If you're not sure if it's hurting your soul, ask if it hurts somebody else's soul. Go and ask them what the colors are like, and then get them to look at your page and go from there. Sometimes the second set of eyes that you want to burn out are a good indicator of like whether or not you made a good choice here. But generally speaking, with your colors, make sure they're readable, make sure they're not like ridiculous and really hard to read. Or like this, where they are really high contrast, but they're really hard to read as well, because they just have a lot of strain on your eyes. So just be careful with any of these things as you're going through it. And one last thing with CSS, when you are setting colors, if you get some weird colors that are going on in your background, one thing that you might find is that your HTML element sits behind your body element or your content element that you're putting in there. So if you change the color of the HTML and then you change the color of a body tag, HTML, any of the space the body tag isn't currently taking up, the HTML will take up. So just be careful, because you can find something like this, for example, where you set the background color of the content to be whatever this is and expect the whole page to be black, but then you accidentally set the HTML and then now it's got a weird red bar. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing any of your CSS. For individual elements, whenever you get so now that we've worked our way in, so we worked our way from kind of outside inward. So we basically took the body, we kind of styled all that stuff, and then we worked our way inward slowly, and now we're looking at colors and all that stuff. At the end, there's kind of the individual flare pieces that make it kind of look cool. Here's some options you can have in there: adding shadows, adding in background colors, adding in like depth with Z indexes and stuff like that. All of this stuff is here for you to look at if you're interested in it down the road. The last thing here that I'll talk about is precedence. Some errors that you will run into with CSS is that, like I said before, if you have a div and it's changing the color of something, and then you have something inside and you try and change the color of it from the outside, it won't change. And that's what's called precedence. And so essentially when you're looking at CSS, the big thing to keep in mind is basically be as specific as you need to be. So if you want to color everything on the page black, then color everything on the page black by just changing the color of the body. But if you want to make an individual element change a color, make sure you target the individual elements. Don't try and just change a whole bunch of things, because what happens is that the more specific you are, will override things that are less specific. So if you ask it to change the color of, let's say, every A tag on a page to red, every A tag on the page will be red. If you then say, select all of the different tags and make them blue, the A tags will still be red, because A is more specific than every tag that's inside of a body, for example. So whichever one is more specific will be used, essentially. There's rules inside of it here, but that's the main thing. When in doubt, honestly speaking, what you can do is just add in an inline style. Inline styles take precedence over everything else. So it's a way of cheating. A lot of people don't like it. They're not here. They aren't teaching the course. So you can ignore that. But yeah, if you need to, just use an inline style and it will make sure that you're at the most specific you can be, essentially. If you do run into other problems, or you do need to change something from the outside in, what you can do is you can mark it with a exclamation point and then say important. And this basically says, this is important. It's as simple as that. So if I say color red here and I say important, it is very important. It's a really, really important, essentially. And so that's what you're telling the browser. And so it will listen to you and it will make sure that that's set from there. There are a bunch of tools and utilities and stuff for CSS. CSS honestly just takes a little bit of time to just work with and just use. It is, I don't know, I think I know probably less than 5% of the stuff there is to know about CSS, and I've been doing it for years, just because honestly speaking, there's just too much stuff inside CSS. So when you go out and look and see there's a whole bunch of CSS stuff, don't worry about it. You'll probably use like 5 things. I basically use width, height, max width, max height, margin, padding. The stuff basically that we covered today is most of what I use for all of my CSS. You don't really need anything else that's fancy for the most part. But if you do want to find out things that are fancy, there's some resources that are online here that I've left some video resources and some just directly web resources you can take a look at. And since writing CSS from scratch sucks, what we're going to talk about next week is frameworks. And basically, this is a fancy name for we're going to take other people's code that have done it better for us. So CSS frameworks are basically a way of using some existing sort of rules that have been set up for you and some existing CSS that's been set up for you, and then you add your sort of stuff on top of it. So all of that margin stuff and everything like that, that's all been set for you, and then you just add in your stuff on top of it to make it look better. So that's how you're going to do 9 times out of 10. That's how you're going to do most of your development, because life's too short. It's not worth writing your own CSS from scratch all the time. So this is what we're going to cover next week, which will make this much easier. So on the topic of stealing things. So one of the great things about the web is that they have to send you everything you need to be able to load the page, which means you have everything you need to load the page while you're there. So if you're ever wondering, man, that looks cool, how do they do that? You can just find out how they did it. So if I want to, for example, let's say I wanted to come into the Shul Connect page, and I'm on the home page, I'm like, this text is like actual text. It's not just an image. How do they do that? You can literally just right click here and hit inspect, and this will show you exactly how we did it. So here's the code for it. And if I go ahead and click on this H1, I can see, oh, there's like a whole bunch of rules inside here. And now I can go through and I can start deconstructing rules. I can go, okay, what happens if I uncheck that? Okay, so that's controlling the color. Cool. What happens if I uncheck that? Okay, that's what's making it uppercase. Cool. I can see how that works. And then maybe I want to find out, okay, well, why is this part hollow and then that part isn't? Okay, well, when I'm looking in here, I can see here, oh, there's like, what does all this stuff do? Oh, that's like the stroke, but then the color there is different, and there's some other stuff going on there. And what you can see here is that we've actually just kind of hacked it, where we made the inside of it a different color and then made the border a different color. And that's how we made this work. And you can just find that out by just checking things off and on. So anything you need to know about web development can pretty much be learned by just inspecting and then stealing other people's code. You can just right click here and just go ahead and hit copy. One thing to keep in mind with this is that there is some stuff that you can't just copy somebody's entire website, obviously, and then just expect to be sort of like have no issues with that. But there is a lot of stuff that you can learn from in order to learn how things work. So just keep that in mind. There are a ton of tools you can use to learn how websites work and modify websites. There's actually, even if you want to go in here, you can actually just straight up save web pages to your computer and then go from there and start breaking things on your version of their web page to be able to understand how it works. You can open up this will save an HTML file as well as the CSS and start just breaking stuff to see kind of how this all works. This is a super useful tool to figure out how anything works. You want to go to Walmart, you want to figure out how Walmart's website works, you go to Walmart. You want to go to Amazon, you go to Amazon. You want to go to any of these places, go to them, find their stuff, and you can figure out exactly how they did different things. So yeah, there's also a bunch of other stuff inside the dev tools, by the way. That's not the only thing you can do. So the dev tools on most Chrome browsers, you can open them by hitting F12. So if I go ahead and hit F12, we can see all this stuff. And then the section we were looking at is elements here. And we can see this gives us our CSS on the right-hand side, and it gives us like our information about whichever one we're currently highlighting. So if I go ahead and highlight this nav element here, then I can see what that looks like up here. If I want to see, for example, like, hey, where's all this margin and padding come from? I can come into compute it and it'll tell me where all the margins and paddings are, and I can click on them and see what all that stuff looks like. There's a bunch of other stuff inside here. So there's the console. We'll talk about this when we talk about JS. We're going to ignore the fact that there's a bunch of errors on the home page here. Just forget you saw that. And then you can come to sources. You can actually just see our CSS file. You want to see what our CSS looks like? Here's what our CSS looks like. It's right here. You can see all of it. You want to see what all the different images look like? They're all right here inside of the sources tab. You want to see what happens whenever you load a page? You can just come to network tab, hit refresh. That's all the stuff that happened when I loaded the page. So DevTools is a great way to find out how anything works on the web, and we'll use it for a bunch of stuff down the road as well. So yeah, we talked about all this. And yeah, you can, if you do make changes, by the way, you can also export those changes if you really want to, but usually it's actually not that worth it. The only thing that will save is if I go ahead, for example, and like highlight this, if I come into styles and I were to add something inside this element.style, then I could say, for example, like color blue, something like that. I could save this and it would work, but the only reason it works is because it's adding it inline. So you could just save the page and then just add it inline anyways. It doesn't really matter. So there if you want it. If you don't worry about it. Not everything works when you save stuff locally, just as a disclaimer, but usually it does. So if you do want to figure out how stuff works, this is a good way to do it. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you can also find out about. There was a blog post that I wrote that covers a bunch of stuff about attributes and other attributes that you can use that are really fancy. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can look at with that if you're interested. So wrapping this all up today, we covered a whole bunch of stuff. We covered the basics of HTML. We covered the basics of CSS. And next week, we're going to look at using other CSS that already exists to make our own CSS a little bit better and be able to make it much, much, much faster, way faster than we could have if we just tried to do everything by ourselves by scratch. So we'll talk about that a lot next week. The last thing that we're going to talk about is the end of session exercises. So each week we have these exercises that are optional for you to do. They are for Ignite points if you do want to submit them. And basically, for this week, the exercise is going to be articles. So essentially, we've given you some of the code to get started for a blog post about pelicans in Calgary. And you're just going to go through and style it. You can style it however you want. You can use whatever sort of stuff you want. I would recommend using the code that we kind of outlined here, but you can change whatever you want about that as well and just kind of make it look nice. There's different levels, so you can choose which levels you want to do, but this is kind of what level 1 to 2 would look like, and all the information is available inside. If we go inside the exercises folder here, and we went to end of session exercises, all of the information here is kind of inside this README file, where it'll basically say, here's level 1 and all that stuff. If you want to see what this file looks like, you can press Control, Shift, and V, and that will open it this way, and then you can read it from here. Alternatively, you can go to the GitHub page that was linked at the very beginning, which I've lost. So I'm going to come to here and find it this way. If you go into day 1 and then go exercises and then end of session, it'll also be right here as well. So if you want to read it this way, you can read it that way as well. This will include all the information about how all this stuff works. But yeah, this is kind of what level 1 and 2 will look like. This is what level 3 will kind of look like. You can submit your exercises. Here's a link to do that. And if you have questions or anything like that, you can ask away as you need to. I'm not sure. I'm sure Fanny can answer if the Discord is set up and everything, if everything's already been sorted out. I missed session 0, so I'm not sure what's going on with that. Yeah, I'll let you go. If you have anything for that.
Yeah, so the Discord bot that sorts all the groups are not currently working, but I'm sure if you ask any questions in like the help or the general channel, then whoever's available can answer the questions.
Perfect. So yeah, so you can go ahead and just ask the question in the Discord and people will be happy to help you out as you need to. That's basically it for this week. So next week, we'll be covering some easier use of CSS by using CSS frameworks and doing all that stuff. And I hope you enjoyed it. So have a good rest of your night. That'll be it. And then mentors, if you can stick around, just so we can have the debrief session. That'd be great. Thanks.